I was given this title of Investing is Hard to Do, which I think actually John or somebody took off a blog of mine. And it's a bit negative, really. So I prefer slightly more positive titles. So it's Investing in Energy Efficiency is Hard to Do, but it's going to get easier. So the topic is really about how do we increase investment into energy efficiency. And I'm going to touch on a number of points. I am going to talk about the Investor Confidence Project, and I'm going to talk about changes in the paradigm of energy efficiency, which will make a difference. Like a previous speaker, I have to share a disclaimer. I'm going to talk about an EU-funded project, so I'm just going to show you this disclaimer, and then everybody's read it. So, okay, so Amber Rudd was talking today about resetting energy policy, I believe. I didn't get to see the speech, or I haven't got to see the speech yet. I shall read it with interest later. But I suspect that there wasn't that much about this stuff, the built environment, which is actually the biggest energy resource that we have. And not only is it the biggest energy resource that we have, it's the cleanest, quickest to exploit, and it has least problems. And we could use it very quickly, unlike Hinkley Point or shale gas. So we know that potential is there. We've known that for a very long time. There's 40 years of study of potential for energy efficiency in the built environment. But there's this gap that everybody talks about, the energy efficiency gap. And that's the gap between all that potential and actually what's being done. There's a massive gap. You know, we all can find individual projects that are being done and programs, but there's a huge difference between what's being done and what the potential is. And if we're going to achieve either environmental aims or energy security aims, we need to reduce that gap. And we can only reduce that gap by accelerating investment into energy efficiency. And that really means bringing in external investment that's currently not going into energy efficiency. So I like to compare energy efficiency with every other energy resource. At the end of the day, energy efficiency is just another energy resource, and we need to think about it more often. And if you look at the financing of energy resources, oil and gas, if you were lucky enough to own an oil and gas field, well, certainly before the price came down, if you're Rupert's friend in Qatar and you wanted to develop that oil and gas field, the way that you do that and the way that you finance it is now very standardized, very common, and you could go to lots of banks in the city or anywhere in the world and raise money on the back of an oil field or a gas field using very standardized techniques. If you had a site for a wind farm, again, prior to recent changes in subsidy regimes, back from, say, 95 onwards, you could develop that wind farm and you would, again, be able to go to lots of places for the money. You would use very standardized techniques to develop the model, document the project, do probability analysis, something called a P90 study, and you would go to any one of, say, 50 banks in the city and you could raise money on that. Very standardized, very mainstream, lots of money available. I have to say, when I did one of the very first wind farms in the UK in about '89, it wasn't standardized, and we just made it up as we went along. And there was one bank in the city who also made it up as we went along. But after that, it developed into a very standardized system. But if we look at energy efficiency financing, and I just used the Empire State Building, famous energy efficiency project as an example, the way that energy efficiency is developed and projects are developed is definitely not standardized, and it's definitely not mainstream, and there's only a tiny, tiny volume of investment and lending going into energy efficiency. And there's very, very few places that you can go to for finance. So energy efficiency financing at the moment is completely different to energy financing. And in fact, there was a great status report on energy efficiency financing. One of the US bankers I know who's doing energy efficiency financing says the trouble with the energy efficiency financing market is the ratio of conferences to deals is too high. So here we are at another conference talking about the same problem. It is getting better, but it's still too high. Okay, so I talk a lot about the jigsaw of energy efficiency financing. I used that jigsaw when I did this in Germany, which is why I have that slide. And it is a jigsaw. Fortunately, it doesn't have 1,000 pieces. There's a fewer number of pieces. And that's what I'm going to talk about today a little bit. So I'm going to talk about, or show 6 pieces of jigsaw. I'm not going to talk about all of them in great detail. There's capacity building in financial institutions. If you go to the average bank, or you phone up the average bank and say, can I talk to you about energy efficiency? They'll probably send you to their facility manager rather than some loan officer or banker. Capacity building on the demand side. The reality is the demand levels in the customer for energy efficiency aren't that high. The development gap, that's how you go from potential to projects. Capacity building on the supply side. The energy efficiency supply industry needs building up in lots of ways. And product offerings, and I'll talk a bit more about that at the end. And then the big one is standardization, and that's the key piece which I'm going to focus on for the next piece here. So standardization is a big problem, or lack of standardization, I should say, in the energy efficiency industry. Now, if you haven't seen the report of the Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group, I recommend that you read it. The EFIG, as it's more conveniently called, did a big report about how do we increase the flow of investment into energy efficiency. And EFIG had members from the real estate industry, from investors, banks, from all over Europe. And it was created by the European Union and the United Nations Environment Programme. So they did a big report, and they said the major problem is lack of standardization in project development and documentation. That's a major barrier to increasing investment in energy efficiency. And there are other people who've said this. Citigroup have said it, Deutsche Bank have said it, all kinds of investors who are interested in this have said this, but EFIG kind of summed it up. So standardization, if you've got a factory, factories rely on standardization. You cannot have a factory without standardization. That's the secret of the Industrial Revolution, was standardization. But what people forget is this is also a factory. Whether it's Santander or Deutsche Bank or RBS, doesn't matter. Banks are basically factories. They work on standardized processes. And that's where the Investor Confidence Project comes in, really, to try and bring that kind of standardization that you have in oil and gas, standardization that you have in wind farm development, to energy efficiency projects. And the Investor Confidence Project started in the US about 5 years ago. I brought it to Europe 2 years ago, and it's now funded by the European Union and various foundations. And the heart of it is about creating standardization. The reality is now, if you have 3 projects done by 3 different energy efficiency developers, ESCOs or consultants, it doesn't matter which, they will develop and document those projects in a completely different way. And if you had 5 energy consultants look at this building, even if they all said change the lights to LED, they would develop and document those projects in a different way. And that just doesn't work for financial institutions. And it has 4 main consequences. Greater performance risk. If every project is developed in a different way, the risk of how they actually perform is bigger. You just don't know what it is. It's got higher transaction cost if you're trying to lend money to it, because you have to dig into the detail of each individual project. And also, if you're a bank that actually wants to lend money to this stuff, and more of them do want to, you can't build human capacity around ad hoc processes. You have a standard process, and then you can build human capacity and teams around it. Just like in the wind farm business in 1990, you didn't have big wind teams in lots of banks like you do now. You had a couple of kind of enthusiastic people in one bank who said, we can do a deal here, and we made it up as we went along. And also, importantly, you can't aggregate. Energy efficiency projects are very small. Even if you look at the Empire State Building, big project, the energy efficiency element of that was $13 million, which is tiny by the standards of institutional investors. So this lack of standardization creates these problems. And that's where the Investor Confidence Project and protocols that we're developing come into play. So the Investor Confidence Project protocols cover the whole project development cycle, from baselining, calculating savings, looking at design, construction, commissioning, O&M, and then ongoing measurement and verification. And it's important to stress we're not in the business of creating new technical standards, because there are plenty of technical standards out there. We're talking about organizing the way that people use those standards and they document the project, so that at the end of the day, an investor or a lender can look at a whole pile of projects and know that they've been developed in a similar way. So in Europe, we're developing 6 protocols. 4 are already published and out for comment, and they're on our website. Anybody can download it. All of this is very open source, very collaborative project. But we have protocols covering apartment blocks and tertiary buildings, so anything that's non-residential. The difference between large, standard, and targeted, large is large retrofits where people are doing a lot of different measures and there's a lot of interaction, and you tend to use simulation software. Standard tertiary is kind of a lower level than that. And then targeted is when you have one measure. So if you're just doing LED lighting or a new boiler, you would use the targeted protocol. And there are these protocols, and then on top of that is a project development spec that is a kind of how-to-do-it guide for any engineering team looking at this. We have, across Europe, a network of, I think, nearly 100 allies, as we call them. So they're banks, investors, energy efficiency developers, property owners, and so on. And anybody can join up. It doesn't actually cost you anything. I'll happily send you the link, or if you look on the website, you'll find it. It basically says you think this is a good idea. And within that network, more and more projects, it's not really our main focus, but more and more of those project developers are saying to us, where is the finance for this? And we're putting people together within that network and linking up projects to investment. So that's a very, very quick, kind of short overview of the Investor Confidence Project. Things that you can do, as I said, you can join up as an ally. Doesn't cost you anything. You can join a technical forum and help guide the protocol development. But most importantly, we're now working with people with real projects and real investment programs to embed these systems and these protocols into those projects. And in fact, I think we have one in the room who may want to talk, who may be happy to talk to you later. So this is really happening. We're doing real projects in the UK and across Europe now using these protocols. And it's sort of become very central to the whole of the EU's kind of policy on energy efficiency financing, which is nice. It's kind of sometimes a bit worrying when it gets such high-level attention, but on the whole, it's a good thing. So it's all happening. So I would encourage everybody to look at it, happily talk to you about it later, and hopefully sign you up as an ally. Okay, I said I'd just talk about a few other pieces in this jigsaw, because I do think it's a jigsaw, and we need to put all the pieces together. Capacity building on the demand side. This goes back to some of the things that were talked earlier about. Why do people want to do energy efficiency or sustainability projects, and how do we make more people want to do it? The layer cake of energy efficiency benefits. It's always good to have cake early in the afternoon. There are lots of energy efficiency benefits. It's not just the energy saving, and again, we heard about some of them earlier. If you're talking about the project host, the building, the benefits can be better productivity, better production quality in a production environment, maybe even more sales in a retail environment. Health is a really important one. And these benefits, or these co-benefits, have only really just been recognized in the last few years. And people are now starting to value them. And there is some great work, probably people know about the work being done by GBC, Green Building Council, and M&S and others, who they're trying to value some of these benefits. And when that work comes out, I think that will be a very important piece of work. And, the interesting thing about this, and again, this was touched on earlier, energy efficiency, and this was a horrible realization I had after more than 30 years doing energy efficiency is the most boring thing that you can talk about, ever, in the outside world. It's just completely tedious. But if you go to CEOs and you start talking about increased sales in a retail environment, that is like instant attention. That's cool. I want to talk to you about that. I don't want to talk about energy saving. That's really dull. That's what the boilerman does or the FM guys do. So we need to talk much more about co-benefits, and we need to value the co-benefits much more. And I think that whole area is going to grow quite significantly. Okay, so on the other side, I put these two together because they are linked. Sort of capacity building on the supply side, so this is the energy efficiency industry, consultants, ESCOs, project developers, and then product offerings, so business models, really. And that's the next piece that I want to talk about. There's a lot of talk about the market for energy efficiency. And again, it took me probably longer than it should have to realize this. There is no market for energy efficiency whatsoever. It does not have a market. There is a market for stuff, and stuff being insulation, boilers, windows, stuff. That's what you buy. You don't buy energy efficiency. So, to talk about a market for energy efficiency is actually complete nonsense, because there is no market for energy efficiency. And then you talk about energy performance contracts, and it was kind of raised earlier, the issue of energy performance contracts. Lots of people, and I've kind of lost count of the number of people who've come to me in the last few years and said, I've discovered energy performance contracts. It's the answer. It's going to solve all the problems. So obvious, blah, blah, blah. We have been pushing energy performance contracts for 40 years or more. And in most markets, particularly the commercial market, they don't actually work very well. And people say, but it works in the US. And you look at the US market, and I think the US market is something like $16 billion. That's just like tiny, I don't have the numbers on my head, but I think, the market for pet food is like $900 billion or something. It's much, much bigger than that. So, it's not a significant market. It doesn't really work. And we need to get away from those traditional models. And there's some signs, I think, that this is starting to happen. I think the paradigm is about to change. And there's some really interesting stuff going on in California, which is significant. And again, some of us are trying to bring this kind of thinking over here and happily talk about it more. If you look at the energy efficiency market, which there isn't one, but let's talk about energy efficiency today, everything is based on a predictive model. You kind of do your engineering, you do your audit, and you have a model, and the model says, I'm going to save so many kilowatt hours, okay? But it is a model, and as we know, some of those models are not actually very good. Usually if there's government involved, there's some incentives or there's a mandate, like ECO. ECO is basically a mandate where the government says to the energy companies, you must spend X on energy efficiency. But there's no real accountability for the savings out of those projects. Again, you're buying stuff rather than energy efficiency. And so you end up with kind of performance regulated through a very bureaucratic quality assurance process. And I think the Green Deal, now we can kind of all be totally honest about the Green Deal. And so, the problem with the Green Deal was you basically were paying for stuff, whatever the stuff was, and you had to jump through all these hoops, which were very bureaucratic, added loads of cost and complexity. And at the end of the day, you didn't know, as an investor or as a householder, what you were going to save. There was no measured performance at all. So that's the old paradigm. I think the new paradigm, particularly with the new legislation in California, once it comes in, well, it's actually in, but once it starts to take effect, it's very much based on quantifying actual savings on measured performance. And we now have the technology and measurement and verification and building to do this in almost real time, probably in real time, that you can actually quantify actual units of energy saved and measure that performance. And that allows you to do something really powerful. Then you can actually just pay for the units that are delivered, just like you do for energy, just like you do for everything else. Then you're not paying for stuff. And how you get to deliver those units, actually, you don't care. You might put some stuff somebody might put some stuff into the building, or they might do some training, awareness stuff, and that might work. You actually don't care. You just want to pay for the units that are delivered. And that really allows you to align the risks, the innovation, the project finance. Because if you have a stream of savings which is measured, you can have a PPA, a power purchase agreement for that stream of savings. And you can raise money on a PPA. So this gives you a way of financing a lot more retrofit work. And it also allows the utility to buy that strip of units saved in a reliable way, instead of, at the moment, turning on all these diesel generators, which they hope will work on the day. So, this shift in the paradigm, only just beginning, but really quite powerful. And the net effect, I believe, and we will see it develop in the next few years, is kind of a scalable market-based approach to energy efficiency procurement. More importantly, we're actually measure what we're getting. We have never measured the results of energy efficiency. We talk about, paybacks on projects, and you say, and I've been in meetings with bankers, and they say to the energy efficiency people, show me the data on the project performance. And the energy efficiency people say, we've got all this data. You say, where is it? Well, we don't have any data. So, that's where it's going. I think that's the future. A lot of that is kind of predicated on having standardized projects, standardized measurement and verification, which we're beginning to introduce, standardized development processes like the Investor Confidence Project. This is a really powerful paradigm shift. And I say, starting like lots of things in California, it would be nice to try and bring it here, and we're starting to work with some companies and energy companies and investors to do that. Okay, development gap. I'll just talk very briefly about the development gap. I think the big problem in development gap is traditionally we've done like one project at a time, one building at a time. And if we're going to really address the issues that we have to address, we have to take city-wide programs or portfolio-wide programs and develop projects. And somewhere along the way, we seem to have lost the ability to do that. I say that we lost the ability to do it because back in the 80s, we did do that for quite a large number of local authorities and other large portfolios. Capacity building in financial institutions, I'm not going to dwell on it, but banks and other institutions need to understand energy efficiency much more. There's actually a big project that's coming out of the European Union fairly soon where they're going to work with some of the really big banks to try and build capacity. And there's also a lot of projects being backed by the European Investment Bank where they're training and building capacity in the banks that the EIB lends to for energy efficiency. So there's a lot going on in that field. So I think we can put this jigsaw together. I think the parts are starting to be defined more than they have been before. We're starting to put them together. I think in the past, people have kind of focused on one, and traditionally in the energy efficiency industry has always said, oh, the problem is lack of money. There is no lack of money. If you have bankable projects, there is no shortage of money, absolutely none whatsoever. So the future, I picked up this photograph of a 1920s German cigarette card in Peenemünde, the home of the V2. It's a fascinating cigarette card series on the future, and the two ladies are quite clearly using iPads to Skype their friends. They do have a flying car in the background, which we haven't quite got to yet. They also have cigarettes, which is a bit kind of old-fashioned. But anyway, I'd just like to use that one for the future. There's nothing new, everything's been thought of. So thinking about the future, I think we need to pay for performance, actually measure what we get out of projects, out of investment. You pay for performance on other things. Why not energy efficiency? Don't pay for stuff. And energy financing, as I said at the beginning, oil and gas, wind farms, very standardized, very mainstream, large volume. Energy efficiency isn't. I think if we can put the pieces of the jigsaw together, we can actually end up in a situation where energy efficiency becomes much more like energy financing, and it will be standardized, it will be mainstream, and there will be a large volume of places that you can go to for money. That wasn't supposed to happen. And I think if we can do that, put all these pieces of jigsaw together, we can end up with a situation where this energy resource is exploited to the full, and that is a better future for everybody because it's lower cost. All those huge co-benefits, no issues with all the issues they have with energy supply options like nuke or flat fracking. Take your particular favorite or least favorite. They all have massive problems. This one, if we get it right, put the jigsaw together, there's lots of money looking at this that wants to flow into it. We can actually end up exploiting that energy source. So, thank you.